everyone, and welcome to Money Matters with Shannon Jackson. On today's show, the latest Equifax Canada Consumer Trend Report shows many Canadians, including many here in Ontario, are continuing to struggle with monthly debt obligations. Are you one of those that are among them? Are you worried about how these missed payments are impacting your credit score? Joining me now with advice on how you can safeguard your credit score and even improve it during a time of prolonged economic uncertainty, we have Julie Kuzmic, Senior Compliance Officer of Consumer Advocacy at Equifax Canada. Julie, thank you for being here today.
Such a pleasure to join you, Shannon.
Before we get into our main topic, can you share with our viewers a little bit about yourself and about Equifax Canada?
Sure. So Equifax is one of the two major credit bureaus in Canada. The other one is TransUnion. And the role of a credit bureau is to receive data related to consumer credit accounts and compile that in the form of a credit report, as well as calculate credit scores based on that data. And that information is often used for consumers in Canada when we're applying for new credit. We're applying for a new credit card, for example, car loan, and so on. And so with your consent, the creditor that you're applying with can access that information and use that along with other pieces of data to help make a decision around whether or not you'll be approved for that particular credit. So that's one of the roles that Equifax plays. I personally am focused on a couple of areas. One is compliance with consumer protection legislation, but the other is around helping to build confidence amongst consumers in Canada. I want people to understand how these things work and have a clearer picture so that they can make their own credit decisions with more confidence.
Well, that's a really good description, and I really appreciate that. And I sort of want to start our conversation, obviously, with the latest research that Equifax has provided. So it's the Equifax Canada Consumer Trends Report. Now it's showing that consumer debt has reached $2.54 trillion. Now, Julie, obviously that is a massive amount. Can you give us a little explanation about what makes up this $2.54 trillion and how we've come to reach that amount of debt?
Yeah, so this is data from the third quarter of 2024, and a lot of the comparisons that we do are on a year-over-year basis. So we compare what happened in the third quarter of 2023 to that period during 2024. And one of the things that we saw some interesting changes in is auto loans. So that would be a car loan if you're leasing a vehicle. We saw the amount that is owed for car loans and leases increase by 12% in that year-over-year comparison. And that's for non-bank lenders. And for the banks who offer car loans as one of their offerings, the increase was a little more modest at 3%. So in general, we're seeing new car loan originations are up around 14% from the previous year. So that's some interesting changes that we're seeing in the market. We think some of that is related to affordability. So we have seen some drop in used car prices, and we're also seeing some better lending rates now being offered for new car purchases. So we think that those are some of the contributing factors to this data that we're seeing in the market.
And this number also includes, I'm going to assume, our mortgages as well as sort of any other debt that we might be carrying?
Yeah, we do often look at non-mortgage debt as well, because sometimes that can give a bit of a clearer picture because mortgage amounts can be so high, so that might skew the data. So we've found some interesting things when we look at non-mortgage debt over the last several months. Maybe I'll dive into them if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Go right ahead.
So the age group between 36 and 65, so that sort of older millennial, younger Gen X group, their average non-mortgage debt is between about $27,000 and $34,000 per person. When we compare that to a younger age group, like 18 to 25, so the people who are just getting started, just getting rolling with credit, their average debt is below $10,000. So there is quite a jump as you start to see the increase in age groups. And even the 26 to 35 group, that's around $17,000 on average per person. So still about $10,000 less than what we're seeing average non-mortgage debt reporting at in those slightly older age groups.
Do you think, is there any kind of reason why you think the older age groups are experiencing that higher amount of debt?
The older age groups are more likely to have mortgages, for example. And so there is that possibility, and it's certainly been in the media a lot, the shocks that people are experiencing when they're renewing their mortgage and seeing that monthly payment jump quite substantially. So there are a few possibilities there. It's possible that some people are not using the full amount in their mortgage account. They're moving some of that debt over to something revolving, like a line of credit, possibly a home equity line of credit or a standard line of credit from a lender, or possibly even needing to use credit cards in order to get through daily expenses. And it looks like we're seeing some increases in credit card balances as well.
It seems as well those demographics are experiencing a higher level of delinquency or missed payments as well. Are you seeing that same data?
Yeah, so the way we define delinquency is that typically means that on a particular account, somebody is 90 days past due. So that would be 3 months of not having paid that account, or worse than that. So 3 months or longer past due on an account. And we are seeing those numbers increasing as well, which of course is a bit concerning.
Has there been any notice about with this increase of debt load that the country is handling in the over $2 trillion? Does that have anything to do with perhaps newer Canadians arriving in the country? Is there any kind of a trend with regards to newcomers?
What we see is an increase in overall credit card balances, and there are a few contributing factors there. When we look at, say, the number of overall credit accounts that exist, or the number of the total balance of all credit card accounts at a particular point in time, there is a contributing factor that as new people arrive in Canada and open new credit cards, that is going to increase the number of open credit card accounts, as well as increasing balances that people may be carrying. And we are seeing that month over month, fewer people seem to be able to pay their credit card balance off in full compared to previous quarters. In fact, we have seen in general, overall credit card debt has increased by just over 9% in that year over year comparison.
I know I'm definitely seeing in my practice, I'm seeing an increase of people that are coming in to see me with unmanageable debt, and they're in that age range of that 36 to 45 age range. So I'm definitely seeing a correlation between what I'm seeing on a firsthand basis with what Equifax has been able to calculate here. So that's quite interesting. Now, for those who are maybe struggling to handle their debt load, do you have any advice for those who want to manage their debt without maybe having that negative impact on their credit score?
Yeah, so I definitely want to start with a bit of a reassurance that you're not a bad person if you're having trouble making all your payments. It is so common as you're seeing in your practice. So please try to take that to heart and recognize that everyone has bumps in the road, needs some help along the way, and that's perfectly fine. Now, when it comes to credit score calculations, one of the things that is really a big part of the calculation is payment history. That's because a credit score in general is trying to predict the likelihood that someone will pay their bills on time. And therefore, there is a heavy balance of looking at in the past, has this person paid their bills on time? So when you're balancing your payments, one important thing to keep in mind is that it is better to make the minimum payment on something like a credit card or a line of credit. It's better to make that minimum payment prior to the due date or on the due date than to pay it in full, but a little bit late. That's one of the important things for people to keep in mind.
That's really interesting. I wasn't aware of that, but that's good to know. It's like you say, part of the score means your payment history. And so paying on time, the minimum payment seems to have a better impact than paying it in full at a later date. Is that right?
Correct.
That's interesting. That's good to know. Are there any kind of warning signs that people should maybe be looking at when it comes to maybe not being able to manage their debt? Should they be looking out for some triggers?
One of the common things that tends to happen as people are struggling financially is an increased need to put day-to-day expenses on credit. So if you perhaps were in a position a year or two ago where, sure, you're using your credit card when you're at the grocery store, but then you're paying off the balance each month and carrying on in that way. And now you're finding, as you're using your credit card at the grocery store and buying gas and your other day-to-day activities, if you're not able to pay that balance off from one month to the next, and you're seeing that balance increase month over month, it is not a fun position to be in. It doesn't feel great, but it is so much easier to get help earlier than later, to start looking at ways that you might be able to adjust things in order to prevent that snowball from rolling out of control.
Yeah, and I think it's important as well to really closely look at your cash flow. Set your goals in place, because if there are some higher credits being recorded on your credit report, if you set yourself a plan to repay those things, I mean, there's a number of different strategies where I think we're all mostly familiar with the debt snowball or the debt avalanche, depending on which one you think is most advantageous for you. But I think putting that plan in place. But I appreciate your guidance on, if we do put a repayment plan in place yourself, whether it's the debt snowball, for example, you still want to make those minimum payments on those other cards as you work away at that one maybe credit card that you want to pay off as soon as possible. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So of course, we've had this prolonged period of financial strain, I think, that people have been going through for the last few years. And we know that the credit score of millions of Canadians have been impacted, including many here in Ontario. And after the break, we're going to be talking more about your credit score, what that score says about your credit worthiness. And we're also going to talk about the importance of monitoring your credit report and your credit score as you move forward. And most importantly, how can you get a copy of it? We're going to dive into that when Money Matters returns after the break.
This program is brought to you by Rogers Xfinity, connecting you to more of what you love. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
This is a man's heart, a heart in desperate need of medical attention. But because 78% of Indigenous people experience racism in healthcare, he may not get the help he needs. Become an ally. Rise above racism in healthcare.
Public transit, garbage pickup, parks and recreation programs, snow removal on your street. How can you stay informed about these and other important local services? Tune to City Council coverage on Rogers TV. See your community leaders at work on Rogers TV City Council coverage.
Welcome back to Money Matters with Shannon Jackson. My guest today is Julie Kuzmic, Senior Compliance Officer and Consumer Advocacy at Equifax Canada. And we've been talking about the latest Equifax Canada Consumer Trends Report. While the report shows lower interest rates are helping, there are those that are still struggling to keep up with their monthly debt obligations. And delinquencies are continuing to rise, unfortunately, including here in Ontario. And when delinquencies are rising, it's safe to say it is having an impact on your credit scores and our credit reports for many individuals. So, Julie, let's take a little bit of a deep dive into this because there's a bit of a misconception, I think. Can you tell us the difference between your credit report and your credit score?
Yeah, that's a great place to start because often those words get used interchangeably, but they're not actually the same thing. So let's start with credit report. That is the collection of all of the credit-related information that has been sent to Equifax about your credit account. So that's typically credit cards, lines of credit, car loans, mortgages. Anything that is a credit account can be reported to a credit bureau generally. So the report is the collection of all of that information. And someone's credit report can change from one day to the next because new information is always coming in. Most of the accounts on a credit report will get updated once per month, but that update cycle is typically linked with the statement period. So for the sake of argument, if you've got a MasterCard where your statement is usually generated on the 6th of the month, every month, and maybe you've also got a Visa card, and because of when you opened and activated that account, the statement is generated on the 25th of the month each time. You're going to see those two accounts getting updated around those time frames. So MasterCard is typically updated on your report around the 6th or 7th. That Visa card typically updated around the 25th or 26th. So that's the credit report. Now we've got a credit score. And what a credit score is a 3-digit number between 300 and 900. It is based on the information that is in your credit report. So only information in your credit report can be included in a credit score calculation. And the purpose of a credit score is to give an indication to the risk management folks at lenders. So whether that's at a bank or credit card issuer, it gives them an indication of whether you're likely to make your repayments on the schedule that you're going to agree with them on. So that credit score, it's just a number. It's calculated based on that information in the report at the time the score is calculated. So the scores go up and down throughout the month as well as the information changes in the report itself.
That's really interesting about the frequency of the changes. Like you mentioned, it's usually based on the billing cycle. And so 1 week you may have a score at 650, and the next week you'll check it and it's perhaps a little bit higher or maybe even a little bit lower because a new creditor has reported new information to your credit report. What other things, you mentioned earlier that your credit score is made up of partially your payment history. Are there other criteria that are used to calculate that score?
Yes. So all of the elements that go into a credit score calculation, they go into that calculation because there is a statistical correlation between that element on a credit report and people's payment history. So let me give you an example. We talked about payment history being one of the biggest pieces of the overall credit score calculation because it turns out people who've made their payments on time in the past tend to be more likely to make their payments on time in the future. Now, I'm simplifying quite a bit here. I don't want people to get the idea that if you've missed some payments, that there is an expectation that you'll never pay a bill on time again and your score is going to stay very low. That isn't the case. Some of the other elements that have that statistical correlation with on-time payment include the amount of a credit account that you're currently using. The term for this is utilization, and I'll give you an example. This is typically more focused on revolving accounts, which are accounts that have a credit limit that you're allowed to carry a balance on. So the most common ones would be credit cards, as well as lines of credit. So just to use some easy round numbers, if I have a credit card that has a credit limit of $10,000 and the data that gets reported to Equifax in a particular month is that my balance is $5,000, I'm using 50% of that credit limit. So that utilization number would be 50%. Those elements can affect credit scores because there tends to be a correlation between higher utilization, so a higher balance relative to the credit limit, and the possibility of missing payments. Some of the other factors that go into the credit score calculation include things like the length of time someone has been using credit, the age of the credit accounts that are on the credit report, as well as the mix, the types of accounts that are on the credit report. So is it all credit cards? Is it maybe a mix of installment loans, like a car loan, in addition to credit cards? And then the last one that people often get quite hung up on, but it can be a relatively small part of the equation, is what we call hard inquiries on the credit report. And all that is an indication that you have applied for credit within the past 3 years and the date at which that occurred. So that number of how many hard inquiries there are within the previous 3 years from the date the score is being calculated, that can have an impact on credit score calculations as well.
Are there any best practices that people can implement in order to maintain or even improve their credit score?
Yes, and this is where people are often leaning in, hoping that there's going to be a really big, exciting, here's the secret, this is the one thing you need to do. And there is one thing you need to do, but I'm afraid it's not as exciting as many people are hoping, and that is pay your bills on time. That is the behavior that the credit score is trying to predict. So if you start out, you pay your bills on time, as you build that positive credit history, you typically will start to see that score going up. There aren't big tricks or games that you can play that will help cause an overnight jump in a credit score, for example.
So all of that's been really good information. I really appreciate that. For those maybe that are looking at a credit score that has been negatively impacted over the last few years, is there a way that they can turn around that score? You mentioned already, pay your bills on time. Are there any other strategies of improving that credit score moving forward?
I love that question because that is very common, that people will end up with an accidentally missed payment, or they've gone through a rough patch and they see an impact on their overall credit score calculation. It's important to know that there are a lot of consumer protection rules in place which limit the amount of time a negative credit piece of information can stay on your credit report. And for most of the negative items, and the type of thing I'm referring to here is an item in collections, for example, several missed payments. Those types of items are automatically removed from credit reports 6 years from the day that they initially occurred. So that isn't something that you would need to ask to get removed. That will happen. Now, as those items get older and older, so let's use an example of if I had misplaced a bill, I didn't realize I was behind, it ended up going into collections. Even though I've paid that item in collections, it will still remain on my credit report for 6 years from that time that it initially went into collections. And this, I know, is a very upsetting thing for some people to hear, but here's the silver lining. If you continue making on-time payments after that negative or collections item is present, then the impact that that one item has will go down over time as it gets older and closer to that 6-year mark where it will automatically be removed. Now, I want to be very clear that it is critical that there aren't new missed payments or new other potentially negative pieces of information being reported. Obviously, that will not help that score increase, but just something to be aware of. There is a light at the end of that tunnel.
And that's interesting because a lot of people will ask, especially in my line of work, well, how long does it take for my credit to improve? And there's never a definitive number. It seems that it's a combination of your behavior with regards to your repayment of your debt, as well as a length of time. Is that correct?
Generally, yes. And it starts to get really complex when you're looking at what the different elements are on somebody's credit report that are bringing down the score. So in an example where you maybe have had a consumer proposal or a bankruptcy, there are going to be a few places that is reflected on the credit report. So each of those accounts that is included in that consumer proposal or included in the bankruptcy, there will be an indicator in that section, as well as an indicator of the bankruptcy or consumer proposal itself in a separate area. Now, all of those do have that 6-year time frame, but because they may have occurred slightly staggered compared with one another, not all exactly at the same time, you might see them start to drop off with slightly different times as time progresses.
Well, with the couple of minutes that we have left, can you tell us how someone, first of all, can get a copy of their credit report?
Anyone in Canada can get their credit report for free online at the Equifax website, equifax.ca, and you also can access a free credit score at the same time. So once you have to create an account there in order to prove you are who you say you are. Once you've done that, you can actually go back once a month, so every 30 days, and refresh that information at no cost. You can see what has changed in your credit report in that last 30-day period.
And if you are checking it every 30 days, does that have a negative impact on your score?
No, it doesn't. I'm so glad you asked that. There are a lot of misconceptions around that. When you check your own credit report, that is what we call a soft inquiry on the score, or on the report rather. And soft inquiries are never taken into account into credit score calculations, and they also aren't visible to lenders. So lenders can't see that you've been looking at your own credit report.
That's amazing information. How often, if we're not checking it monthly, how often would you recommend that the minimum somebody should be looking at their credit report and their credit score?
I would say at least once a year, even better every 6 months, because there are many credit score calculations out there. You might see a different number depending on the source of what you're looking at for your credit score. They're all between 300 and 900. But they are all based on that data on the credit report. So that's where you want to focus. Make sure that data is accurate on the credit report.
Well, Julie, thank you so much for being here. Can you tell us again the website for Equifax Canada for our viewers?
It is equifax.ca, EQUIFAX.ca.
Thank you again for being here and for all of your great information. I really appreciate it. And I want to thank you, our viewers, for watching. Until next time, I'm Shannon Jackson.